you so much, Sonali. Now we
Sure,
have.
sir. Thank you.
Just a second. Now we have Miss Amita Puri. Amita, if you are there, so turn. Yeah.
Yes, I'm here, Ajay.
Yeah. Hi. So let us welcome Miss Amita Puri. Your face is not visible. If you can adjust your camera. Yes, now it's visible. Yes. So she will be mainly presenting on data protection framework of the companies, especially the listed companies. She is an independent researcher and a consultant with Partners in Change. Partners in Change has been doing a lot of work on this front, especially on the business and human rights, and they work with a lot of companies, and especially she'll be presenting for those companies who are in the ICT sector. So how do they take up their data protection for framework with respect to children? And she will be talking how it has to be facilitated. So over to you, Amita. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Ajay. Thank you firstly for giving this opportunity to me and Partners in Change. Give me a second. I'll just share my presentation. Let me know if you can see the screen.
Yes, we can see. Please also keep your video camera on. It is better that if we can also see the screen and your face. Yes, now it's better.
Okay. So some of the context was built up yesterday through all the discussions that we had. We heard how the all-pervasive nature of the online world. If we start our day, how do we start it? By an alarm. We wake up to an alarm on the smartphone. We scroll through our WhatsApp and emails. We work and study online. If we're looking at children specifically, look at videos, part of it. So look at shopping and end the day with streaming services. We also heard about the benefits that came with the online world, allowing the children to express themselves, to play, to learn. But also the risks associated, the inappropriate content, the inappropriate attempt to touch us, the online sexual abuse and cyber grooming, cyber bullying, and the extent of some of it and the issues associated that you and Sonali brought about today. And therefore the need to ensure that online services put the welfare of the children first. Hold on. Sorry, the screen seems to have hung.
No, I don't think so. You can click anywhere. Click anywhere on the screen and use your keyboard down button.
Yeah. So thanks, Ajay. So the need, therefore, so we've looked at also some of the initiatives. So UK has a digital design code for kids and teens. USA is coming up with the proposed Kids Online Safety Act. And India has a draft protection bill the Joint Parliamentary Committee has presented, but it's still not really there. However, the India bill does have, it does prohibit, the provisions does prohibit the profiling, tracking, or behavioral monitoring or targeted advertising directed at children, and undertaking any other processing of personal data that can cause significant harm to the child. If we look at the UK one and the US one specifically, then their provisions do look at tools and safeguards needed to protect against toxic content. So therefore, they require the online platforms to refrain from promoting harmful behavior, including suicide, self-harm, eating disorders, and bullying. It also requires platforms, most importantly, it requires platforms to publish annual reports about their potential risks to minors. There have also been some voluntary initiatives as a result of what has come through. And primarily, if you look at it, it's primarily through maybe some of it that we heard Shireen speak about yesterday as far as Facebook is concerned. And Google has also come up with some initiatives which include defaulting to private upload on YouTube for those under 17, turning off autoplay on YouTube Kids, and blocking ad targeting based on age, gender, or interests of users under 18. But how do you, so there are lots of things that we spoke about that need to be done, which include looking at establishing national standards, looking at boundaries that protect children. And part of it is also about how do you hold businesses accountable for keeping children and teens safe online. So some of it, internationally, if we look at the movements, then you have the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is a framework for preventing, addressing, and remediating business-related human rights abuses endorsed by the UN Human Rights Councils. You have India's own. It started with the National Voluntary Guidelines on Social, Environment, and Economic Responsibilities of Business in 2011. Is it me or? And then which were later adapted to the National Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct in 2019. SEBI then looked at a reporting framework, which is now known as Business Responsibility and Sustainability Reporting Framework, the earlier erstwhile called BRR, which has been made mandatory for the top 1,000 listed companies by market capitalization from 22-23, but is voluntary this year. So that is just the background. What the committee itself mentioned was that they realized that some of the reporting framework is generic in the sense it cuts across various sectors, and there may be a need therefore to look at sector-specific reporting frameworks. Which is where Partners in Change initiated a sector-specific reporting framework for the ICT sector. This has been supported by UNDP. So where or why do we need a disclosure mandate? So UNGP itself states that communicating their policies, the mechanisms, helps both in strengthening the mechanisms as well as promoting transparency and accountability. It also helps the consumers and the civil society use the parameters then to demand and strengthen the mechanisms in place. So that is why we looked at it. What is the process that we followed? We looked at, when we looked at strengthening the BRSR framework as far as the ICT sector is concerned. So first we looked at how do we define the ICT sector. We then moved on to looking at what their current disclosures were via a reading of the business responsibility report, the current, that is the currently mandated responsibility report. We then held both individual as well as large group roundtables with businesses, with workers, with civil societies, and human rights defenders to understand what issues associated with the ICT sector were and how could rights of stakeholders be therefore protected. We simultaneously also reviewed the laws, the global standards that were applicable for the ICT sectors. And then we had a working group internally, which put this together to list saliency from the lens of human rights of workers, communities, value chain members, consumers, and businesses. We then ratified this via the consultations with 4 constituencies. We looked at business workers and unions. We looked at CSOs and human rights defenders and experts on disclosures. We mapped the saliencies with what are known as the National Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct, which the Ministry of Corporate Affairs had come up with. And we then reviewed the existing BRSR questions against these saliencies, and we modified and added questions for ICT specific disclosures. For just reference, the principles in the National Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct are 9, and they cover themselves from how the businesses should conduct themselves in a manner that is ethical, transparent, and accountable, to how they should provide goods and services in a manner that is sustainable and safe, how they should look at well-being of employees, including those in their value chain, how they should respect the interests of and be responsive to all their stakeholders, how they should promote and respect human rights, how they should respect and make efforts to protect and restore the environment, ethical lobbying, how they should look at inclusive growth and equitable development, to how they should provide value to their consumers in a responsible manner. When we looked at salient issues, and children are an important constituency across all, when we looked at the issues that came up that were salient to the sector through all the consultations, through all the research, we kind of listed them and divided them into 6 major groups. The first one was around basic freedoms of citizens, which included issues such as right to privacy and data protection, the freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly and association, and the right to free elections. We looked at the second category, which was human rights at the workplace, which is right to living wage, right to association and collective bargaining, right to safety and health. We also looked at human rights across the entire value chain. And when we mention the value chain, it includes the end consumers too, where they get their stuff from. Which includes right to human rights compliant procurement and right to protection, the most important one for today's session, from product abuse and misuse, which includes child protection. We also looked at the domain of how human rights can be aided or restricted in the wider business domain. So some of it came up yesterday, which is the misuse, protection from misuse of algorithms as shield to camouflage human rights violations. Then the issues of what we are looking at, your Uber kind of platforms. So labeling themselves as ICT sector to evade other sectoral regulations, because the ICT sector's regulations are evolving at the moment. And right to protection for emerging systematic inequalities in human resource processes. This includes your surveillance technologies and others. Then we looked at the fifth basket, which was around the human rights of local communities, their right to free prior informed consent and compensation, including rehabilitation, their right to participate in CSR operations of businesses, and their right to environment and health. We also looked at the human rights associated with ICT sector's role as facilitator of state responsibility. You see the ICT sector taking over, whether it is health, whether it is through the Aadhaar, this thing, IDs. So they are present everywhere. So their embedment in the state monopoly sectors, in the delivery of basic and essential development roles, and their role when they are embedded in specialist committees, structure and functions of the government. So these are, like I said, the salient issues that were put into basket, saying, well, if we look at the ICT sector, here are the principles as far as the national guidelines for responsible business conduct mandates companies to follow. Here are the salient issues that were identified that are critical to ensure that the rights of all stakeholders are protected. And therefore, what is the current mandate as far as the reporting framework is concerned? So as I mentioned, SEBI mandates that all companies disclose against parameters relating to those principles that I shared. There are 9 principles of responsible business conduct, and the current framework mandates that businesses disclose both their policies, their mechanisms, and any violations to those principles in the reporting framework. So when we looked at the current BRSR framework and the research and the salient issues that cropped up, there were additional questions that we thought were vital from the protection of, or from the right holders' perspective, that ICT companies especially should report against. And these were some of the questions. The ones that are highlighted may make sense for rights of children, but I think all the questions are important from ensuring that that the experience from the ICT companies is responsive to the rights of all stakeholders. So so if you look at the first one relates to the supply chain, but the second one, if you look at, are mechanisms that the business has to ensure that use of its products and services by third parties do not contravene human rights. That does the company, and some of it, like I mentioned, the consultations brought, and I think Ajay, you only brought up the fact that when companies develop software, do they have an ethical code that is applicable both for themselves as well as for the clients that they have developed these softwares for, and what are the aspects that it covers? When you look at, we also looked at, so it looked at, like I said, it looked at all the 9 principles and issues that were salient. So whether it was via e-waste, how are companies looking at the issue of disposal, recycling? How are they looking at promoting the rights of their workers? If you look at, again, question 6, then does the business use surveillance technology to track employees and workers? And what are the safeguards that they have put in place? We also thought that, and this is important for children and across all stakeholders as well. What are the kind of grievance redressal mechanisms that are in place? Where is it what are the protection mechanisms as far as whistleblowers are concerned? How do you ensure and listing of the last year incidents, if anyone has been terminated or transferred after raising the complaint, because that will show if the whistleblower protection mechanisms actually exist in practices. Then when we look at data protection, the other thing that comes into the forefront is the fact that the state requests for data, which actually impinges on the data privacy and protection rights of individuals. So the question is around how many approaches were made by government ministries, regulatory authorities, law enforcement agencies for details on users of the products and platforms. And of the approaches made, how many were acceded to and how many were denied. The protection mechanisms for data leaks for consumers, and more importantly, how does it assess the risks that exist in place? Whether the company has a specific policy on child protection with respect to children being users of products and services of the company. And if yes, does any independent agency make an assessment every year? The next one on their data protection policy, while there is an existing question on the data protection policy, but does the protection policy has details on informed consent in every stage of data use, provides copy of those details, and provide options for users to still use the product or service, which is very important even on refusing consent, and allows them to correct or delete information, and that a declaration that the company is complying with NGRBC principles. Then does the entity publicly disclose information about processes for responding to data breaches? And yes, if yes, then the link to the information shared. We spoke about the advertisements yesterday. So this one specifically on, do you have a policy against spam messages and others that are irrelevant to the product to ensure advertisement guidelines are being followed? I mentioned those were the additional questions that we looked at as far as disclosure norms were concerned. But we also looked at, so apart from that, we also looked at modifications of existing questions. So we spoke about the harms. Yesterday, we heard about cybersecurity and risks related to data privacy. And that question in terms of a policy already exists. So, and this one I've shared in terms of, does the data protection policy have the following features? And in terms of data breaches specifically, number of instances of data breaches along with the impact, and percentage of data breaches involving personally identifiable information of people. So this was what we had looked at as far as strengthening the reporting requirements of the BRSR from the ICT sector is concerned. And primarily what we were looking at was to ensure that we have enough information on their data collection practices, their content moderation practices, and the algorithm use, and prohibit. So in terms of the rules themselves, especially, how are their behavioral advertising to to ensure that they're not using behavioral advertisement or manipulative design practices that push inappropriate content to children. So that is it from my end. I would welcome any feedback that you have on the disclosure requirements. Are there ways that we can use to strengthen these mechanisms?
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. Thank you, Amita. Thank you for bringing this important dimension in the discussion of 2 days, especially on business accountability towards children, because these companies, whether they are internet gaming companies or e-commerce companies or social media companies, we may call them just by the name of Flipkart or Amazon or Facebook or WhatsApp, but these are companies basically. And uh, the and they have accountability towards data protection and especially towards children. Only thing that we need maybe towards the end, when we discuss it jointly, we will need to discuss whether these are mandatory disclosures or mandatory reporting or voluntary reporting. Number one. Number two, are these mandated and enforced by our Ministry of Corporate Affairs or by just the SEBI? And whether these companies are listed in India, and whether they are kind of, there is some sort of accountability framework, or there is some sort of framework which the government has some say or can enforce. So we need to discuss, especially, yes, when we are talking about safety of children on the internet space, on the online space, then we need to work on all dimensions, the policy dimensions also, and the corporate policy dimensions also, because until unless it is there, the provision is there in the corporate their own memorandum, and the government kind of takes report or seeks accountability, it's going to be quite difficult. In fact, after the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, they brought about the intermediary guidelines. Even Shireen was talking yesterday, and Dr. Dhaval Gupta was talking yesterday, uh, that after the intermediary guidelines, there has been an increase of takedown